Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Option Menu Crew podcast. This is episode 33, and with you today, the crew members are myself, Ryan, and we've got Ed with us today as well.
Yep, it's me, Ed, and I guess Ryan's gonna explain our long running feud here, but we're excited to preach a topic that we both have been had on our minds for a while.
Yeah, we've been going back and forth, and we decided to do this topic coming off the series of platform-specific discussions. So we wanted to have a little bit of fun here. We're going to settle a long-term rivalry. No, actually, we just wanted to get into it because we've been teasing each other back and forth about the pros and cons of turn-based games versus real-time games. And while most of our experience comes from RPGs, real-time is clearly not limited to RPGs, and RPG-style mechanics have spread far and wide across video game genres these days. I don't know. You'd be hard pressed to find a game without some sort of experience point counter or experience point equivalent system. But yeah, we wanted to kind of delve into it.
Everything has a skill tree now. Everything has a skill tree now.
I don't hate skill trees,
I mean,
so that's the thing. But like Zelda and Metroid are one of the few that still don't have something like that. You like collect individual units of things or tools, and they turn out to be like new attacks or abilities and stuff like that. And I'm sure there's plenty of other indie games both mimicking those and in other styles. But you're seeing a ubiquitous amount. But that's all besides the point. So we were just really talking about the two styles of gameplay here, and we're going to talk about pros, cons, things we'd like to see in both here. But Ed, since you have the naturally inferior turn-based system, why don't you go first and take your turn ahead of mine on like your current opinions on the two sides?
well, I don't think I feel as strongly as you in either way because there are plenty of action-based games that I enjoy and plenty of turn-based games. Um, but I guess the reason I'm taking the side is because you do frequently um, take an opportunity to point out how much better action-based are. And I know you'll have your complaints later on, but I guess like I said, I feel the need to defend it because I it is a type of combat that I enjoy, and you know, I guess I don't need to, there's no reason for me to defend it. It's just fun.
Yeah, and this isn't.
um,
Oh, sorry. Keep going.
yeah, I was gonna say, I think like you, uh, early on in our experiences with RPGs, we started with turn-based because years ago that was most of what was available,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
later on, action has become more popular. And I guess these days it would be accurate to say that turn-based is much smaller niche of RPG and another game combat. So it is. I think there are plenty of games keeping it alive, and even some that are changing from action based to turn based. But um, it's certainly smaller than it used to be.
Yeah, it is smaller. A lot more games are real time types of combat and interaction and things like that. I'm not saying that overall. I was joking when I said that turn-based was like inferior. It is just a different style of game. It's a different genre of gameplay. So it's got its merits. It plays in a distinctive way. It'd be like me comparing a racing game to football. They're two different types of experiences inherently. So it's not like one's really better than the other. They just have different options. I personally enjoy real time more for some very specific reasons, and that's completely just me because as we'll get into, there's different stuff. So like you were saying, we started out with turn based, and the technology kind of facilitated turn based better than real time. Although, talking like the Super Nintendo and Nintendo era and that very early era, those very early home console gaming eras, including Sega, Genesis. We'll talk arcade too, because arcades was full of a variety of games as well. So I would play like side scrollers and beat 'em ups. I loved Ninja Turtles, Turtles in Time. I loved Mega Man X and the sequels there. So I played those as real times, and I really didn't experience a turn-based game until I witnessed someone else playing Final Fantasy VII on PlayStation 1. And then I ended up going back and trying Super Mario RPG because I'm like, well, how does this play? This seems interesting. And that's when I kind of realized what turn based was and how RPGs played at the time and what they were like. I didn't really try too many other RPGs at the time. I just didn't really understand what to look for in the games they had there. Like I'd seen at Blockbuster, like Final Fantasy 2 and Final Fantasy 3 on the shelves, but I didn't know what they were, so I didn't know why I want to get that. Or Earthbound as well. And it was funny because my Blockbuster did have an Earthbound box that was the huge American box with the full strategy guide in it. I don't know if you could have gotten the strategy guide when you rented it, but they did have that giant box on there all the time. And that always intrigued me. I'm like, what kind of game is that? Um, but as I came to understand, like once I'd played Super Mario RPG, which made me comfortable with then trying Final Fantasy VII when I got a PlayStation or I was lucky enough to be able to rent it and try that. It was just in my head that, oh, RPGs are supposed to play turn based because you have this party of characters. And how else are you going to control this party of characters? You just couldn't do it. And then I also played Pokemon for turn based. And that's kind of where my experience came for most of that. Uh, and it wasn't until then Kingdom Hearts 1 on PlayStation 2 where I understood or I'd been able to see that, oh, you can have this real time combat with a party of characters. And it's just a matter of you don't have to control the other characters. They just move on their own. As long as the game controls them well enough, then it's fine. I still like when you can control other party members and be able to issue orders at the very least to those characters. And there's plenty of games now that have managed that. So and that's part of like technology needed to get better. Now, also previously in other games, like you could do multiplayer and you'd have RPG elements and things like that, and then your party was your friends, which is like if you think about Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop games, that's where like that experience comes from. So it's not that you couldn't do that, but you would require multiple people to play it. Actually, I'm pretty sure I don't know if Final Fantasy 2/Final Fantasy 4 had this, but I know on Super Nintendo for Final Fantasy 3/Final Fantasy 6, there was a secret feature, or I believe it was secret, is that if you plugged in a second controller, another person could control the additional, or could also play with you, a second player, and control some party members. I don't know exactly how that worked, if you just divvied up and alternated between who takes turns in the actions, but that was there. But that would be jumping ahead to another point we'll get there, is about like the differences between the two and where they kind of overlap. And then like the cooldown based games that are kind of turn based but also kind of real time. But I don't want to get there just yet. So
So
go ahead.
I was gonna say you mentioned Pokemon, and my I think I probably started gaming a little later than you did. You're a little older than me, and I think you started a little younger than me. So my
Hmm.
first system that I played was a Game Boy Advance,
Hmm.
and I believe Pokemon was probably one of my first games, and that probably first RPGs too. And I think that's probably the case for a lot of people my age. It was so popular and it's very accessible to children.
Hmm.
Then I was into Golden Sun. Really liked those games, and
Hmm.
I think those really still hold up well. I played some of the Final Fantasy re-releases on Game Boy Advance. I think I had like the 1 and 2 collection. That was interesting. Those games are interesting.
I'm sorry,
Um,
which ones?
and the Final Fantasy 1 and 2 on the Game Boy Advance.
Okay.
There was a collection with both of those.
Yeah.
And I did end up playing some turn-based RPGs on the PS2 after I got that. I played Final Fantasy X. I played some other less popular ones. I played some of the Xenosaga games, which I liked. I think I played one of the Shadow Hearts games, which is pretty cool. And I didn't end up branching out, like you said, into Kingdom Hearts. I played I guess this is Western game. Do you ever hear of the Champions in Wrath games? Kind of like Baldur's Gate, the kind of like isometric hack and slash RPGs. I
Yeah,
was
yeah.
way into that.
Or like
Yeah,
Diablo.
I played. Yeah, but this is yeah like Diablo, but it was I think it was like a Sony developed one.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if I ever really went into it with like the preconceived notion that an RPG was inherently um, turn based versus action based. Uh, I know there were action games, action RPGs that were before the PlayStation 2 era. I played a Mana game on a Game Boy Advance, and that's a series that goes back. I guess you could argue that the original Legend of Zelda was kind of like that, and there were Ease is a series that goes way back. So, but I think you're right that the idea of a party based action RPG is more relatively recent compared to turn based. Um, so I can see where that would be something that would be new and exciting to you.
Yeah, and so it wasn't until much later that I actually understood why I started liking turn-based less and less. The real-time thing with the party with that, but uh, Kingdom Hearts 1 started to like have help me have this perspective shift. And then it wasn't until I was talking with some friends about other games and we started talking about random elements, RNG. And that's when, after thinking about some stuff for a while, it suddenly clicked that actually what I was really frustrated with when it came to turn-based games was the amount of RNG in the gameplay and how little agency I had, or how little agency I felt I had over certain aspects. So mainly in a turn-based RPG specifically, or a turn-based combat for the most part, you don't have as much agency over your defense or your and only so much you have more over your offense because you can choose your attack, you can choose where you're targeting, which usually you're targeting a specific enemy. Then there's like tactical games where you can usually on a grid, and they're typically tactical RPGs, but I don't know if they're all considered RPGs. Um, but you can target like an area, and you'd be able to hit that, and you can see where that's going to land for the most part. Um, and that's where I started to realize, like, oh, it's the defensive aspect. I don't like that I'm gonna take a hit, and there's nothing I can do about it, and then I get into those loops because there's been scenarios where the enemy's going to use like a one-hit kill attack, or they're going to do like a huge sweeping party damaging attack, and then all you can do is try and play catch up from this attack. And even if you had like full health or near full health, and something just hits you, or the random chance of a um, debuff type status element or status effect, excuse me, is happens, and then it just completely throws your plan out of whack. And now you can prepare, of course. Like you can choose your weapons, your armors, and your accessories to do specific types of spells and effects to protect you from the different types of status elements. You can use inaction type stuff or even items to help protect you from that. Although I don't know how many items actually give you preventative against status effect other than like accessories or armor. So there's ways you can strategize to improve your chances. But there's still stuff like once you're in the fight, something's going to happen. Sometimes you can't stop the attack. Sometimes it's part of the boss's gimmick where you can actually interrupt them. And then that can be both based on the encounter or the game itself having features where you can actually interrupt. Um, but I found that's the part of turn-based that really upset me and I wasn't jiving with. And there is middle ground. There are certain games that are still turn-based that I do enjoy today, but I still go back to Super Mario RPG as my prime example of how to do it right, where they have the reaction commands, where you can press an additional button at the right time in the animations to do extra damage, as well as when you're being attacked, you can press a button at the right time to reduce your damage, and sometimes that can be 0 or you get a miss as well. So something like that where I just have a bit more agency. I don't necessarily hate turn based. I would just like to be able to have more control over those aspects because in real time, you can totally avoid and dodge attacks and you can take more control over whether or not you're going to take a hit. Not that there aren't random elements in real time combat. There still can be status effects. There can still be rules you're not aware of. There's all sorts of pros and cons there that still play in. So it's not that real time's devoid of random elements. It's that I feel like you have much more agency with that, and I enjoy that agency more often than I enjoy the other aspects of turn-based games. And I also feel turn-based games haven't evolved as much. I've seen some good evolutions. Super Mario RPG, like I said, is like still a very unique one. And then they carried that system forward into Paper Mario and into the Mario and Luigi series. And then I've seen some other RPGs with reactive command type stuff. Not too many. I think I could only name.
Most of the Mario games. I do really love the Mario and Luigi series, and I
Mhm.
guess that's, um, you know, kind of the somewhat of a successor to Super Mario RPG. And I'm with you that having the ability to increase your damage with button inputs or reduce or completely avoid damage is a lot of fun and it is engaging. So I can see where that would be more up your alley.
Yeah, and Ed, so why don't you describe from the other side, like what are the aspects about the turn-based elements that you enjoy versus what frustrates you or is you find less fun about real-time games?
Well, I mentioned it before the podcast to you, but one thing that can frustrate me about real time games is the camera positioning, and whether that's you orienting the camera manually or using a lock on feature to focus the camera on a specific enemy. Um, being able to see the action is a consideration that you don't have to take in a turn based system. And, that it's usually not an issue, but some games it's not perfect, and I do like that going into like a turn-based system. I know that that's not something that's going to frustrate me. Um, Turn-based, I it's nice just to be able to sit there and think about your attacks
Hmm.
and take things slowly. Um, and I find that in a lot of turn-based games, you have greater opportunity to exploit the weaknesses of some of your enemies. And I know in an action game, there might be elemental weaknesses to enemies, but in turn-based, like you are usually given the option to view those weaknesses at when you want to, and it means you can select the attacks, and I guess it's usually just a little slower. So I like the ability to take my time and strategize. And I you have mentioned that turn based or action based is a different skill set, and that it does require you to have some awareness and dexterity to avoid and execute
Hmm.
attacks. And sometimes I don't want to deal with that. Um, and you talked about how you can have a party of characters in an action-based game, and that sometimes they're controlled by AI. But I liked the ability to have pretty much complete control over my characters, and you can't do that in an action game because you can only control one character at once. I will say that when you do have greater control over the AI, it can be really nice. Like Final Fantasy 12, I mean, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's kind of a hybrid. And you do have the gambit system where you can set up all the logic for your characters and really automate quite a bit of it. So you're not having to micromanage your characters, and you don't have to worry about whether or not they're doing something that you want them to do. Um, I know in other action games you have some control over their tactics, but Uh, Really, it to me, it's just about having a little more control over the actions of your party and having a little more time to think and strategize. Um, so
Yeah, completely understand that. So let me ask
yeah,
you this question from my perspective, just to see how you feel about it. So, like I said, the part that frustrates me is the RNG elements when it comes to like offensive, defensive, like attacks hitting, missing, causing status effects, or even sometimes enemies having one hit kills or big sweeping stuff. How do you, what's your mental attitude about the random elements of turn based games?
I it really doesn't bother me. Um, I'm trying to think. Probably I like Fire Emblem, and that is huge about RNG. Every attack has a chance of missing or hitting. Every attack has a chance to critical hit. And even your level ups are kind of like random, and that when your character gains a level, the stats that increase, they might get 1 point to 5 or 6 stats, or get 1 point to only one or two, and you don't have control over that. And that really doesn't bother me that much. I guess I never thought about it as a negative. I guess I just accepted that that's kind of a part of those games. And
Hmm.
part of it is just, do you really want to take a risk on an attack that only has a 70% chance to hit? And sometimes you do. And that's kind of how you roll the dice on those things. I think that's it. I don't know if that's I think it's a different skill set, and that you don't have complete control over it, but you're making like a calculated judgment that maybe it's worth taking this risk, and managing those probabilities is part of how you play those games.
Okay.
um but yeah,
So, mhm.
it can be really annoying when the enemy has a really low hit chance to hit, or a low chance to critical, and they just get lucky and demolish you. But I mean, that's just part of the game, I guess. How can you get mad at something that's random? You didn't do anything wrong in that case,
isn't that
except maybe take a risk. But
isn't that the frustrating part though? Is that you didn't do anything wrong, yet the game still like. In fact, you may have set yourself up better, but the game managed to luck out on it.
I guess I go into those games knowing that that's how it works, and those rules don't bother me. Um, so yeah, I don't think that, and status effects can be annoying. Um, so I can understand that,
Those are in real
but
time as well, so I'm not necessarily picking on status effects. I'm just saying it. That is something that's like random, and I'm not sure. I guess I do like it when it's like this attack is guaranteed to do it, but in the game you have like you can use your status healing items. So like if I get hit by this, we're playing near replicant, the scorpions in the desert. If they sting you, you get poisoned,
oh yeah.
guaranteed. Like if that attack hits you, they're gonna poison you. And then the poison's pretty easy to manage. It's not actually as scary as the game wants you to think it is. And then you can also have the items and you can just heal yourself right away. Or you can just get into town and then the status just goes away on its own. Or it goes away after a certain period of time. So once you learn the rules, that's also a lot less scary
And
or
you
or
can get rid
frustrating.
of it. There's items to clear this that
Right.
poison too. One thing that's really annoying about Neo: The World Ends with You, which I'm currently playing, is that there are enemies that cause status effects like poison, but there's no items, so you just like suffer through it until it goes away, which
Yeah.
really sucks. It's really annoying, and it's hard to avoid their attacks and not get poisoned. So really, like in those particular battles, you just have to kill the enemies as fast as you can, because the poison resets by the next battle. So it's
Yeah.
like, well, I better get on it, or else I'm gonna die from poison if I wait too long.
Yeah. And once again, I'm not trying to make you like admit that turn based sucks or whatnot. This is more of an airing of a mutual airing of grievances. Do you have any off the top of your head any particular memories of where RNG really like just screwed you over and you're like, oh man, like I was ready, I had the potions and the Phoenix Downs, or if I got this one or two more hits in, I would have stunned him. Or can you remember any times, any specific events stick out in your mind that you remember, like, oh man, I really just got screwed by RNG?
Um, no, I think because sometimes when you could say I got screwed, it's maybe I got like a little greedy and I was, maybe it's like you're close to finishing a boss battle and you think, well, maybe if I really go all out of my attacks, I can finish it off, but you just didn't have enough in you. And really, what you should have done is played a little more defensively and, managed your buffs or status effects or, there are things you could have done to mitigate it. So, um, and some of the games I've played, like the recent Fire Emblem game I've played, Three Houses, you do have they give you a feature that lets you undo any number of moves, so you can like undo your moves a couple of times. So if something really does go wrong, you can kind of cheese it and be like, well, I shouldn't have done that. But um though it's helpful just because then you don't have to restart an entire battle if you make a mistake. But it also gives you a chance to learn that maybe I shouldn't have made those mistakes. And this is that was one of the first Fire Emblem games I had played to completion, so a lot
Hmm.
of it was me kind of still learning the mechanics. I think if I played next one I play, I would probably have a better handle on how to manage those things. And I might replay it someday too, but no, I don't think there's any situation where I really felt like I was unfairly treated. But I'm gonna play later this year Shin Megami Tensei 5, and maybe once I play that, I hear those are pretty brutal. So maybe once I play that, I will be able to come back and tell you a story of a time where yeah, I just get ambushed and get critical and didn't even have a chance to win. And but I don't think it's going to be as brutal as some of the older ones, but maybe I'm wrong. But I guess I'm prepared to find out. um Probably the most challenging turn-based game I played recently, and it wasn't necessarily that it was challenging throughout, but there were certainly some boss battles that I had to try, five or more times to really get down the pattern of when I needed to buff and when I needed to heal and when I should be attacking. Was Fantasian on iOS,
Hmm.
and that was the one by probably the final game by Sakaguchi, the Gooch, as some people say.
Maybe,
But he,
maybe the final game. Who knows?
yeah, yeah, probably I would be surprised if he makes another one. But that one definitely had some boss battles where the timing at which you buff and reapply those buffs, and when you attack and heal is important. And it was satisfying to finally get the pattern down and really just um barely pull a win on some of those boss battles. And I only played the first part of that game, and the second part just came out. I hear the second part has a lot more challenging parts,
Hmm.
so I'm excited because I really did find I enjoyed uh having a bit of challenge to it that I'm not usually used to. So we'll see how I like Shin Megami Tensei 5, but I feel like I should go into it really trying it on its default difficulty. I don't know, maybe it won't have difficulty levels, and that would probably be better because then it would maybe force me to tough it out. So we'll see how I feel about that. Because I do have a better handle on that type of combat because I've been playing Persona 5, and um I it's not entirely the same, but you get used to some of the conventions. Um, so having more experience with those type of games, I start to enjoy when there is some sort of challenge.
Yeah. So you brought up an interesting point there. It's like figuring out a pattern, and I feel like there are some turn-based fights that clearly where a pattern can be deduced. So I wanted to ask you, when you said that you were like figuring out the pattern, it took you 4 or 5 tries. Did you actively feel like while you were playing, like you were aware there was a pattern, or did the game say anything to tell you there was a pattern, or did you kind of organically figure it out and you like started seeing the pattern, yeah, how telegraphed it was it? And how, did you like feel yourself figuring it out, or was it more like um, you just kind of guessed that there was something going on here and it worked out?
Um, well, in some of those boss battles that I felt there was a pattern that I didn't quite grasp the first time around. It would be that there would be multiple targets, and maybe certain parts of the boss you had to target first to disable some of its attacks,
Hmm.
or other parts they would deploy additional targets that you wanted to beat before they got to their heavy attack.
Hmm.
um, like a lot of most boss battles, uh, you know, every battle in the game has a turn order, and you could manipulate the turn order, and you could also see when an upcoming attack from the boss was going to be extra powerful, because its turn icon would start to glow and kind of pulse. So
Hmm.
you would know that you got to do something to mitigate the damage of that attack, and whether that's you need to apply a buff or you need to destroy certain targets on the battlefield that would enable it to you know execute a more powerful attack. Like there was one boss where it would throw out all these swords that if you didn't destroy them, each of them would do damage to your party.
Hmm.
So what you wanted to do in the next however many turns was make sure you could destroy them all.
Hmm.
But at that point, I think without buffing your attack, you weren't necessarily powerful enough to destroy them all. So you had to make sure that by the time you got to that point that you had to destroy them, you had buffed your attack.
Hmm.
And and it all kind of there was all kind of a rhythm to it. Like the boss would generally follow the same pattern of uh you know do this attack pattern, then the next one. So if you managed your turns properly and planned ahead, and made sure that you were healed and buffed when you had to mitigate those attacks, you could succeed. But the only complaint I generally have about those kind of battles is once you figure out the pattern, sometimes the battles go on a little longer than I would like to,
Yeah.
where um, to finish off the boss, you're doing the same sequence of attacks, four or five
Yep.
times. But it is fun to figure it out and make sure you're in the right rhythm. And that's where I think the random elements of a game are important and actually a benefit to a turn-based system, is because if there was no chance of a status effect maybe failing to apply, or a critical happening, or
Hmm.
attack missing, then every battle would be the same. It would be easy to calculate all the optimal strategy. So I think having random elements is actually important for keeping a turn-based battle interesting, because otherwise it's going to be the same every time. um, and I guess the way a action system achieves that is just that you have a lot of enemies on screen and they're all running their own AI routines, and it's unlikely that they're all going to interact and overlap in the same way every time you play. So that randomness is kind of already built into the game.
Hmm.
But it's not in a turn-based system, so there do have to be some dice rolls just to make you adapt your strategy as you play. Um, but I can see where sometimes it can be annoying, but I guess I don't see it that way. I see it as something to keep it interesting. But I guess I I certainly may curse a bit when I run into something that just spoils my strategy, but it's still fun to finally succeed.
Right. And a lot of the gripes you mentioned in there also can apply to real time combat games, where the enemies can act in ways that are predictable, and even if you figure out the pattern, know what you need to do, it could still take a little too long. Enemies can be damage sponges. And there's also a chance that enemies will diverge from their pattern, and that's something that just has to be programmed in, I'm sure, where the opponents are meant to act in a certain way, and you're meant to figure it out, and that's how you beat them. Or there's a chance that once you start doing the thing that the opponent, uh, you start figuring out the pattern, then the opponent reacts to that and changes. Boss fights also can have stages to them where they'll bring up new attacks or patterns. You mentioned the weak points that you can take out, or there's a certain flow especially if there's minion enemies around a boss or something like that. So there can be all these different types of aspects with real time combat here, that are shared with turn based in terms of trying to manage a fight and certain other gripes. So once again, not saying either one's actually better or worse than the other. It's completely subjective preference. I did want to mention some of the examples I had of like where I can remember that RNG really frustrates me, which or felt really bad. Like in Pokemon, there's a number of attacks that do 2 to 5 hits, and it's completely random exactly how many hits you get. So either offensively or defensively, you're trying to get more and more hits, or or your opponent's hitting you and you have like a bunch of life, but if it hits all 5 times, then it kills you, and there's only so much of a chance for that. And there's no way to really account for that because you could be like, well, I've got 75% of my HP. How am I supposed to know that they're going to use that attack next and there? Because in Pokemon, there's 4 different attack. There can be 4 different actions your opponent can take. Well, also 5 because they can use an item as well, and most of the time. Unless it's a PvP battle. If it's just versus AI, like the trainers and stuff, they can, and gym leaders even can use like items and things like that. And then they added more elements in the Pokemon games later, such as like Pokemon holding items and things like that. So those elements can be there, and yeah, you can eventually account for them. Or you were saying before, how you can look up enemy weaknesses or things like that. So you can get more information, but both real time and turn based, you don't often act on perfect information. There are some games, I've heard there are some tactical games where you can get like perfect information. You know who's going to attack, you know about maybe where they're going to move, and then you can try and thwart that strategy. It's rare because that's typically not the way games work, and that goes to your point about like you want some of the randomness to be able to react to that.
Fire Emblem Three Houses had some of that, to where when you were planning your moves, they would show you kind of lines that
Hmm.
would indicate, um, given the current layout of the board, where which enemies were going to attack which of your allies.
Hmm.
So you had a lot of information to work with. And I played the demo for the upcoming game from Square Enix, codenamed Project Triangle Strategy.
Yeah,
Um, they're probably going to keep that name, but
I think
but
that one's got to
that
be a
one
little
also,
different. Octopath
yeah,
Octopath felt like that felt very intentional. I wouldn't be surprised if Triangle stayed in the name, but I think it's not going to stay
Triangle
like
Tactics,
something like that.
Triangle Tactics.
I could see
Yeah,
it. Triangle, I feel like might be in it, or Try. You know, they're going to use like the part of it. I could feel that being
yeah.
in the name, but Triangle Strategy, I don't think that's gonna stick. That's just my personal guess. Not. You could be wrong, and
That one
then
also
I'll.
has the same feature where it will show you
Hmm.
a line from each enemy to the ally to which that it's going to attack.
Hmm.
Um, and it shows you the turn order. So like you're right. Most games don't have it so that you have perfect information,
Hmm.
but some games give you more than others.
Right. Right. And also, like turn-based, you can usually pull up that information at will, or depending on the skills and depending on the game's feature set. Whereas with real time, sometimes you'll get hints or clues that could help you understand like what to look for. But I feel like in most of the time, real time, you're supposed to be sussing out a combat situation on the fly, and then you can try different things because since it's real time, like enemies can miss in real time, you can dodge better, you can move better, you can attack better, you learn where enemy placement is. And I'm not talking about just RPGs. I'm talking about like any type of real time action game. Like there's a choreography to enemy movement patterns and things like that. So, even if it was like Assassin's Creed or Fallout or Skyrim, or Skyrim, Elder Scrolls. I feel like Skyrim is now the default Elder Scrolls game, but that's just not true. Any of those, even like Call of Duty, Battlefield, any of the shooters and things like that, BioShock. I did want to bring up Mass Effect as well, because since I just recently finished my replay of the trilogy and how that kind of factors into some of this. But yeah. Oh, and then also shout out when you pointed out like with real time games controlling the camera. There are certain games that are way better about controlling the camera, but when we're talking about like action melee style games, like shooting games, if it's a first person or third person shooter, you're pretty much always pointed. The camera's always pointed where you're looking, so that's rarely an issue. Whereas with like action games, I've been playing Marvel's Avengers, and then there's other games. You were playing Neo: The World Ends with You, and there's different types of cameras. So like with Avengers or those like third person action games, I try to pull out the camera as much as I can, and I still get like attacked from enemies off screen, or there's guys that run in from off screen and hit me. They've got projectile enemies with guys with guns that'll shoot you from off screen. You have to figure out where you're being hit from, and sometimes you can get a string of attacks that just screw you up. But to your point on that is there can also be ways to mitigate that, where if you realize you could get swamped, you can back up, you can dodge, and you can start like moving away and get a better ground and reposition yourself. In tactical games, that's an option to reposition yourself. For other turn-based games, you usually are locked to a position. It's like, a traditional RPG, one one team on one side, the other team on the other, and then you just start attacking. Although I will say this, and I want to get into this, is features we like about the different styles of games. Fantasian has that interesting skill aiming system. Enemies can be laid out in whatever way on the pattern, and then certain, I'm guessing, spells or skills, I don't know if it applies to just also like attacks and things like that, where you can aim them to hit multiple enemies at once. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, some attacks like if you're using a certain sword that might have like a piercing attribute, it will hit every enemy in a straight line.
Mm-hmm.
Spells can be curved to hit enemies. And there's other attacks that have like a kind of an AoE where you can target it and hit multiple enemies within an area. Um, and then there's other enemies that might be able to guard, so that even if you have an attack that would normally go through them, it'll stop at that enemy and it won't hit the ones behind it. And that really comes into play with what they call the dimension system. I guess it's a combination of dimension and dungeon,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where you can, as you hit random battles, it will kind of bank those enemies
Mm-hmm.
that you can fight up to 30 at once. And since you have all these abilities to take out multiple enemies at once, you can more efficiently hit them that way than if you fought the battles individually. So it has some good innovations with turn based. Just as a side note, you said that you thought turn based hasn't had that much progression compared to action based. What would you say is like a new innovation in action based combat, um, that makes you feel that way, that it is more innovative?
Oh, okay. You want me to talk about what I think is more innovative in
Well,
action?
yeah, yeah. I just it occurred. You just mentioned Fantasian, and to
Yeah.
me, those two features are pretty innovative with regards to turn-based combat. I don't think I've ever seen that before, and particularly what the part where you can bank enemies and fight them all at once. I mean, that really um, helps make it easier to deal with random battles. Um,
Yeah.
but what's an example of like an action innovation that makes you think that there is more to be done with action-based combat than turn-based?
Okay, yeah, because I was also going to ask the question for you. I was going to talk about turn based, and let's talk about some of the innovative elements there. So I'll go first with the real time, and then also you say about real time, and then we'll transition into the newer features or features we've seen in turn based that we like a lot. We already talked about a few of them. So with real time, that's the thing with real time. The core, I feel the core is always really good. Being able to attack on command, being able to dodge and reposition yourself to actually completely avoid damage and taking hits. Like that core, I feel is super good and satisfying all the time, that I don't need too much else on top of it. However, I do like variety. I don't want to be doing the same like 3 to 4 actions all the time. I always feel like blocking, dodging, jumping is always satisfying. Like those core defensive actions are always great, but I appreciate having complementary abilities, and I don't like always having like the same combo attacks. So if I'm talking about like a more modern game, so yeah, let me talk a little bit about Mass Effect. So there's a couple different ways with that. First off, it's a third-person cover shooter for the most point. Actually, you couldn't snap to cover in the first game, but there was plenty of like stuff that you can hide around it and move. So with the type of abilities you could use in that game, you can turn on special types of ammo. And I'm going to kind of mix and match between the 3 of the trilogy because there's a lot of similarities there. But then you've got abilities that could do damage that are like long range attacks that can either knock guys away, that can deal more damage to different types of, I'm going to call it health gauges, but because there's shield, there's ammo, there's shield, there's armor, there's barrier, and there's health. So there's like 4 different types there that just react differently to different types of attacks that you can wear down. And they diversified things a bit more on how the enemies work. So like in the later game, there's enemies with shields. And they take those shields, I think some attacks can break the shield, like completely break the shield. I'm not exactly sure which ones do, because I had a hard time really doing that. But you could interact with the enemy in a variety of ways where, like, if I shot my one super powerful impact special, the enemy would get stunned and they like reel back the shield and that exposed them, and I could do that. Or you can move around, and since you have teammates with you on most of the missions, what you do is you distract them and you get your teammate to flank them, or your teammates distracting them and you flank them. And then there's different types of skills that can complement that depending on your teammates. So your main character, your shepherd, has its own set of abilities based on the class you choose. Then your teammates are a mix of different classes, and you can use any of their abilities in tandem with yours. They use a cooldown system instead of like an MP type system or points system. So you can only use one skill at a time, and then it's a cooldown based on which one you used before you can use another. And your allies function on a similar system, but each one gets one action. So you can, when you have your 3 teammates, you can do 3 actions and combine them. So I could have a teammate with me that could deploy a decoy that gets the opponent to aggro in that direction, which allows me to flank like a shield guy. I can do, there's combo spells they eventually used, and I'm calling them spells as shorthand. But the combo skills where I have an ally who can create like a distortion field that sits in one area and can catch enemies and like moves them around. It can actually like puts them in anti-gravity and they float around, and then if they don't run out of health, they'll fall to the ground and they're stunned for a little bit. But I can also throw a special type of spell at them while they're being affected by that, and then it creates an even bigger explosion. So combo attacks like that are super fun to do. Being able to switch between different weapon types, I really like on the fly, and that's not always for every game. Not every game has that. Typically, you pick like, if it's like a traditional JRPG or something like that, action, your character usually has one type of attack. But then there's examples like Nier Automata and Nier Replicant where you can change between the different types of weapons on the fly, or you've got Vice or your I forget what the drone's called in Automata. I forget. The pod, and you have like the different skills there, and you can use all those different types of skills. Or let's talk about less of an RPG and more of just like an action game, like Spider-Man. I love all of Spider-Man from PS4's different types of gadgets that he has to use, and being able to switch between them and use them to mitigate the threats and stuff. So that fundamentally, it's all the same thing. It's just like different types of tools. But that's what I really like with action games, is being able to, in the fly, use different types of skills or gadgets to handle the situation, those real-time interactions. And yes, some of this can definitely be mimicked in turn-based for sure. And then it's just the matter of everything happening in motion, for the most part, not always in motion, is really satisfying. Now, Spider-Man and Mass Effect, and also Final Fantasy VII Remake, which neither of us have played, but I've certainly seen a bunch of gameplay footage, and I did play the demo of it, where they've been introducing features where you pause the combat for a little bit to make your next decision in there, whether that's Spider-Man, where you can change which gadget you've got hotkeyed. I don't know if you can use the gadgets straight from there. And then there's Mass Effect, where you can pause the window so you can also change up your weapon, because your Shepard may be able to use a couple different types of guns, from pistol, assault rifle, sniper rifle, shotgun, etc. And then your teammates usually carry two different types of guns, and you can tell them to use different types of guns based on the situation, or you can command them to take a post at certain spots, follow you, move to different places, etc. And also you can pause to use their abilities, because they usually have one ability hotkeyed, and then the other ones you can pause, aim at the enemy, tell them which move they're going to use, and same thing for you as well. You don't have to use that, but as the games got on, you got to hotkey more abilities, so you wouldn't have to pause all the time. And then Final Fantasy VII Remake also has the system where you can switch between the different characters. The game reacts differently based on who you control. And then you can issue the commands when you've got your meters built up to do the different action commands. And you take control of the different characters in order to handle the different situations. Because, like, when you're playing as the character in Final Fantasy VII Remake, you deal more damage, and opponents tend to target and aggro the main playable character instead. So it's a strategic decision as well to take over a different character that might have more health to get the enemies to de-aggro from a character that had less health. Or for taking on, like, enemies that are aerial, you're supposed to switch to Barrett to use his gun to target those enemies in the air, and you'll deal more damage and be able to use more of his special abilities by taking control of Barrett in those situations where you want to get rid of flying enemies. So there's all those types of innovations, and and that's really where it was. It's just like your tool set within there, I feel, is where they really innovate a lot. And there's also, like I said, like, this is not just RPGs. This is every type of action game. So that's where the different types of toolkits, like having a jetpack, having a grappling hook, etc. Like Halo Infinite's got those things coming out. Other shooters have had those kind of things. I'm going to shout out Red Faction Guerrilla for having the different types of backpacks that give you special actions that work in the game. So those are kind of things in real-time games that I've been very appreciative of, and like when they do mixing it and matching. So, Ed, why don't you talk about the real-time systems that you enjoy, and then let's transition over to turn-based and talk about some of the cool turn-based stuff.
Well, one thing I thought of when you were talking about just pausing to select your gadgets or weapons,
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of, you talked about it in Spider-Man, but that's kind of how, like, Insomniac games have worked forever. I mean, like, even the early Ratchet and Clank games, you were able to pause and select your items. You had all
Mm-hmm.
these gadgets available to you. So I don't know how new that is, but Spider-Man is definitely a particularly refined version of that, because the combat really shines when you are mixing up your gadgets and using them in creative ways. So
Oh,
I
then
I can see where you,
that's a good point.
what was it?
Yeah, that's a good point about, like, the weapon wheel switching and stuff is not entirely new. And I was just talking about in general features that are really cool. Something that is a
Yeah.
bit newer, that's real time focused, and this was popularized with Batman Arkham Asylum and the Arkham series, is like the counter combat, where it's pretty easy to do combos, but then the key to keeping your combo going is not only using the gadgets, but then also countering enemies. And so as they come at you, you can do the block or the counter button, and you catch their attacks, you deal a little bit more, you can keep it going, and you can, like, dodge around guys, and as long as you don't get hit, you can do that. So, like, games where you can keep a combo counter going and be able to seamlessly defend yourself and move around guys, like that's something that's a bit newer, that isn't really, well, turn-based does usually have a counterattacks where you're like, okay, you can set this character up with
You
a
mean you
counter
mean like
stance.
like a combo counter attack? Like, the more consecutive hits you make, it keeps track of that.
But I'm talking more about, like, the whole active counter. So an enemy's about to hit you, you time your button press, and then you're able to catch them
Oh,
or dodge, depending on it. Like Bayonetta and has, like, the witch time dodge, or it's much more about dodging. Devil May Cry has something similar, but I don't think like, there was dodging isn't always a big thing in Devil
like
May Cry.
like a perfect counter.
Yeah, or Near Automata is a better example for me to talk about as well. How there's you can dodge and you have some invincibility
Yeah.
frames. Dark Souls and Bloodborne, I think, both have things like that with their roles. Like you have some invincibility frames and whatnot. But what I'm talking about with Batman and Spider Man is that like, and Bayonetta is that like perfect dodge where when you can do
Oh
that right
yeah.
timing, you get extra benefits. Usually, like things slow down. You're much better to get counters or things like that. Um, and I'm not saying all of these are entirely super new. They're kind of refinements of older systems that have been around. And it's not that you can't mimic their effects in a turn-based situation. There's plenty of turn-based games where you have a class with like a counter ability where the character enters a stance from their previous turn, and then if the enemy hits them, then they'll return that, either hopefully reduce damage, but not always. But they catch the attack, and then based on how much they were hit for, they get to act immediately and deal way more damage because you did that risk reward, that planned risk reward. So, but the whole seeing it in real time and reacting as well as how quickly it can happen, because you can have multiple enemies come at you real quickly and counter them all, and it's under your agency. That's the satisfying part of that system.
Yeah, Spider-Man was fun. I felt like part of the key to being successful in that combat was just really prioritizing your dodges, because like, the moment you see that little spidey sense
Yeah,
aura around his head, like you better be dodging or else you're gonna get damaged.
yeah.
So
And the
yeah,
indicator does
that was like,
change.
yeah,
The indicator does change to help you understand what's the best timing, which I appreciate as well.
yeah,
Or to understand like, hey, you can't perfect dodge this. Instead, just get out of the way, or it's gonna
yeah.
or something like that. So, yeah, those are some of the things about real time that I really enjoy. Um, and yeah, I'm gonna come back to Spider Man actually in a minute. But yeah, Ed, is there any things about like in real time combat situations that you kind of prefer over turn based?
I Depends on the game. I will say that Nier Automata was one of my favorite games
Hmm.
in a long time when I played it. Probably ranks up there as one of my favorite games of all time. And it's one of those games where it's rare to me that I was pretty much enjoying it from beginning to end, and there
Hmm.
wasn't any point in it where it was like, well, I got to force myself through this part that I don't think was fun. Um, but the combat, and to me, it's I won't say it's the most complicated combat. I mean, there's a limited number of things you can do, and I liked the perfect dodge. I that is one thing I like a lot. I like that feature where dodging at the right times gives you a bit of a bonus in a way that you can counter an attack.
You can also weapon switch actively, and you get different types of moves and
Yeah, yeah.
combos based on those things.
And I liked that you also had ranged and close up attacks. It wasn't all melee.
Yep.
Uh, I what else? I played Kingdom Hearts 3 in the past. I played that when it came out, and I
Hmm.
liked that. Uh,
Is there?
I guess
Mhm.
I want to talk. What's that?
I was going to ask, can
I
you
want.
think of any specific features? Because I was also going to say Metroid. Metroid's a real time game. Can you? And for me, like I think it is like the mix of the gadgets being like exploration and combat oriented. That and Zelda has a similar uh, setup too. But we can talk about Metroid, especially since Metroid Dread coming out very soon. Um,
Oh
yeah.
yeah,
Is there
in
anything?
in like four weeks now. It's
Yeah.
really close. Less than 4 weeks. Um,
Could you imagine a turn-based Metroid game? Is there? Can you think of that? And you can always come back. But is there? Could you imagine yourself playing a turn-based Metroid game, like maybe XCOM style or something like that?
Ooh, like a turn-based strategy Metroid?
Yeah,
Well, I mean, they did it with Gears, right? There's Gears 5, but they made a Gears Tactics, and I
they
didn't play
did.
that. Actually, I might even try that now that I have Game Pass. I kind of want to try Gears Tactics. I might
There you go.
enjoy it. So, um, but they did that. I mean, I'm sure they could do something like that where they and they made Mario into an XCOM game with Mario and Rabbids. So
Yeah,
like
they
I
made
feel
two
like
of
you
them.
can do any. Yeah, maybe Ubisoft makes Metroid and Rabbids.
Oh, actually, I don't know if well, I don't know if the second one's out yet, but I don't remember if the second one is, like, actually still XCOM style. It looked different, but it was still, like, kinda turn-based tactical.
I don't know. They didn't show that much of it. It's not out yet. They showed it at E3. It's not
Okay,
out until next year.
okay.
Um, like what did I like specifically about Nier and Kingdom Hearts? I think what I liked mostly is that you weren't having to really worry about your party that much.
Mhm,
I don't think I ever played around with the AI or tactics of my partners in those games.
mhm,
I felt like me doing well with the one character I was controlling was enough to be successful in most battles. Um, uh, con- in contrast to what I'm playing now, Neo: The Road Ends with You, where you really have to have control over all your characters, and you can't control them all at once, but the ones you're not controlling can still get hit by other attacks, and you might not be able to dodge with them. So
yeah.
it's a little bit much for me. But I,
Although
I will say, like, you
although
want to
I'm told
talk
you
about innovation. Hmm?
with Neo, just quick, I was told, like, you can mash the buttons and actually they'll all, like, do stuff. I don't know if you've ever tried that.
You can have multiple ones attack at once. And that they it well, I don't want to go into any spoilers, but
I don't think combat
you know
features are that, but that
well,
I think the
I don't
point
need I
was
don't need, I don't need I don't even want to talk about how many party members you can get is where I was going to
the tr
go into it.
well,
But
trailers have shown off that there's at least 4,
okay. Um but
and the demo I
you
think
you
goes up to
can do multiple attacks at once, and there
yeah,
is like some, like, by kind of combining your attacks, you can build a meter that lets you do a more powerful attack.
right,
So it's
right.
it's got some strategy to it. I will say, you want to talk about innovation. I feel like Neo: The World Ends with You. I've never seen anything like it. And you could really say the same thing about the original The World Ends with You. Is they're both really unique, and they do have a twist on action-based combat that isn't seen anywhere else, at least as far as I know. Um, but I think I like them less than certain turn-based games, just because it is a little bit hectic trying to control multiple characters at
Absolutely,
once.
absolutely. Yeah, so
So
yeah, what are some of the features with turn-based, like, that you've enjoyed? Because I've got a number. I've got a couple. Like, I keep calling out Mario RPG, but that's, like, my first one to point out. But what about you? What do you know about what are the specific features of, like, turn-based that you've really enjoyed?
you mean like specific innovations
Unique
in
mechanics, yeah.
certain games?
Yeah, because we all know, like, you take your turn, you attack and whatnot. But even well, I'll start out. I'll just throw it out there. Like, not every turn-based game has the turn order available. So, like, do you like being able to see the turn order? Do you like being able to affect the turn order? That kind of stuff. So, yeah, take it away.
Well, as far as turn order goes, the first game I was going to mention was Tokyo Mirage Sessions Sharp FE.
Mm-hmm.
That was on the Wii U, and I played it on the Switch.
Mm-hmm.
But that had some interesting innovations. It did have turn order, and it was nice because the interface was really well done, to where you could see, as you were targeting an enemy, it would highlight that enemy's icon in the turn order, so you could prioritize killing enemies that were about to act, and rob them of their ability to harm you. But it also had this really cool system where, if you exploited the enemy, or the weakness of an enemy, it would combo into the other characters, to where, like, if you used an ice attack, then another character might have what was called a session attack,
Mm-hmm.
where they would have an ice, then a sword, and the next character might have a sword, then a fire, and it would
Mm-hmm.
chain into these sequence of affinities,
Mm-hmm.
um, to where, if you had a well balanced party with a good variety of those, you would get to the point where you were chaining together, 10 or more different attacks and on these enemies.
Mhm.
And the only thing that would really stop the chain is if you hit a strength, like if you hit an enemy with a affinity that they would absorb or reflect.
Mhm.
um but it also did a good job of giving you the information that it would show you the entire sequence that it would take. So you had the knowledge to know that, if I choose this, these are the sequence of attacks that are going to be executed. And you could see where, well, maybe this is not the right one to choose because it will get interrupted
Mhm.
in the middle. um so I liked that that game did a really good job of giving you the information you needed to make informed decisions. And it was fun just to exploit enemies' weaknesses and see where you could make really, you know effective combos to make make like basic battles end quickly. I will say that's one
Yeah.
thing that's really nice about some games is, it's great in a turn-based game if normal basic battles you can end them quickly. And another game I was going to mention is Persona 5, and that one is also like that, to where if you're able to exploit the weaknesses of all the enemies, you can execute an attack that will do a lot of damage. And if you're relatively um leveled enough for the enemies you're facing, it'll pretty much wipe out the party. So um the enemy party. So you don't have to spend a lot of time in basic attacks or basic battles. And boss battles are where, the majority of your strategy comes into play. um but it is satisfying as you start a new area, because you still have to learn the weaknesses of the new enemies and and come up with strategies. But once you understand the strategies for a given set of enemies, you don't have to execute them in length. You can pretty much just breeze through the battles. So um but Persona 5 had some cool innovations, like what's called the baton pass, where if you exploit the weakness of an enemy, you can transfer control to another party member.
Mhm.
And if you exploit, and you get bonuses, like you get attack raised, you might earn back HP or MP, or it's called SP in the game. Um, and then you can keep doing that up to 4 times. And if you are able to exploit enemies with your 4 different characters, the last one will get an attack that doesn't use any HP or SP. So there's bonuses to smartly balancing your party for the types of enemies that are in an area, because you can execute those baton passes to get bonuses that are effective. Trying to think what else is unique in that. Particularly in the SMT and Persona games, which Toki Mirage Sessions is under that umbrella because it is Atlas developed. It's got some similarities to those games. But you can buffs and status effects are actually pretty important, even on uh boss battles, to where buffs and debuffs are often do work on major enemies. And particular in Persona, a lot some enemies won't have any weaknesses. Like they won't be weak to any element or any type of attack. And the only way you're going to be able to knock them out and kind of, so that you can do what's called a hold up, where you can either talk to them to recruit them or just wipe them out with a stronger all out attack. Um, you can can apply a certain status element, and other types of attacks will do what's called a technical, and it will cause additional damage with a chance of knocking them down. So there's a lot of different ways to combine different attacks to exploit weaknesses and gain an advantage over your enemies. So I think there's a lot to it, and I hadn't seen that in other turn-based games. I hadn't played earlier Persona games, but I've read a little bit about them, and each game um, does add new features and new twists to the battles. And even the the Royal Edition of Persona 5 versus the base edition has a lot of new tweaks that make the battles more interesting and dynamic. So I think there's still a lot of ways for uh, developers to innovate. So I I am excited to see what other ways uh, uh, turn-based games could change. And I did mention earlier about how in Fire Emblem Three Houses and Triangle Strategy, you get more information about what your enemies are going to act. Um, and then Fire Emblem Three Houses also had that ability where you can turn back time and redo certain actions if you made a mistake. And those are all ways that you could argue that they're just basic quality of life features, but they do change the way how you play the game. Um, and it certainly does change. I'm sure it influences the way that the designers lay out the scenarios that you're encountering. So, um, one thing I will say is one of my friends, he's more of a retro gamer than I am, and he was playing some really older JRPGs. I think he got like maybe it was Lunar or something for he has a Sega CD he was playing, and his complaint with all these new JRPGs, he says they're too complicated. So
Hmm.
so all these, I guess these old ones, they were pretty basic in their battle systems in his opinion. So um I guess for better or worse, maybe all these innovations make it less accessible to people who aren't used to the genre. But to me, I think adding new layers of mechanics and strategy just makes the game more interesting. Um, and I think there's probably more they could do with that. So, but I'm not a game designer, so
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. So brought up some cool stuff there. However, like I'll jump off on that, like your friend's comment about like he thinks that the newer ones are more complicated. There's definitely been some revolutions in quality of life when it comes to turn-based RPGs, at least. I was going to bring up Bravely Default for not for their combat stuff, because the Brave and Default system I think is incredible. I really like it a lot. It's still very normal for like a turn-based combat system, but I do find it much more intriguing considering how the Brave system works, where you can get multiple actions in a turn, and that system, in my opinion, or being able to stock up those turns if you want for extra free actions, you can still only take up to 4 actions in a turn, but if you stock up points, then you'll be able to come back around to your next turn, and or you can strategically plan out to do multiple actions over multiple rounds based on how you allocate and use those. And then the quality of life features, like Bravely Default, has prided itself on trying to be um, more player accessible in terms of adjusting how much you want for random battles. You can turn it down if you just want to explore an area, grab the items you missed, or your characters are about to die, so you just want to run back over to the um, to the save point or to the shop and heal up. And so you're like, well, I don't want to die. I just want to avoid all the stuff. So you can just turn it off. Or if you want to grind and you can crank it up and then you can do that. And being able to have that all user controlled is amazing. So in some ways, there's RPGs that are trying to harken back to classic turn-based that are much more simpler. Pokemon still hasn't evolved much over its time. Like it's gotten different moves and things like that, and there's competitive metas. But inside the game, I don't feel like I think Pokemon's still at its core like a very traditional turn-based RPG system. So Bravely Default,
Dragon Quest is another one that
Dragon
I think
Quest,
people don't really want it to change. I haven't played
they
any
don't.
Dragon Quest games. I'd like to try Dragon Quest 11 because I hear nothing but praise for it.
Yeah,
But I haven't yet. But I know that's one that is just so based on tradition that
yeah.
yeah, I think there were a few like inklings that the 12th one might be action based, and I feel like people are just ready to riot over that. But we'll
Yeah,
see.
they should do a spin-off series because they already did like the Dragon Quest Warriors game. I don't know if they did two of them, but they definitely did one. And then there's Dragon Quest Builders, which is more of like a Minecraft style thing. But I think they could do a real time action spin off that's not necessarily Warriors, but just a different type for a different audience. And I think people would enjoy that. And you definitely have overlap and crossover, and maybe some people would be more akin to that. But that's for Square Enix to figure out and eventually do. Maybe they want to keep them separate and whatnot. Another turn-based game. I kept talking about Super Mario RPG with its reactive time system. I'm gonna go back. Final Fantasy VII. Now, for listeners who are super big fans of Final Fantasy VI, I'm aware that the systems between the two are pretty similar, but most of my experiences with Final Fantasy VII. So wherever it overlaps, I'm not going to claim that any of these started with 7. This is just where I saw it. So please don't jump down my throat. But the materia system in Final Fantasy VII is still one of the craziest, funnest systems in the game because you can mix and match different actions between the different types of materia and get some wildly good combos. Some stuff is really broken, or some stuff just changes the way you can play, such as being able to like absorb HP and MP from your basic melee attacks to like the final attack Phoenix system, where you can have a guaranteed like if you get killed, you get to use your summon that deals damage, heals all your entire party, and can sometimes like a key critical element to surviving some of the toughest combat scenarios. I just love the way there's tons of the yellow materia offers all sorts of different types of commands. So you don't have to rely on just basic attacks or basic magic. All these different types of attacks you can do, like and you can allows you to kind of multi-class your different characters. So like you can do throwing items or stuff like that on any character, or different types of slashes and different types of attacks for different scenarios. And then you can still pair those with other types of materia to either give them like elemental status effect, or pending certain combinations, you'll get like special effects for it because it works in such a weird way, or the way people would can stack up so they can do multiple summons, multiple powerful magic spells or summons off of a single action because of the way you paired the materia. So that's another way. Like it can just really varies up how you can interact with the combat. Is those kind of things. I was going to mention I do want to shout out Pokemon that while they're traditional, one of the elements I'd like to see expanded upon is how they kind of the weather effects that they have. They allow you to create these specific status situations or field environment effects, and you can play with them. And it buffs certain attacks, it debuffs certain attacks. Certain Pokemon are better off, other Pokemon are worse off based on that. Like Sandstorm does damage over time on each turn to Pokemon if you're not a ground or rock type or steel type, and has boosted effects for different types of attacks that you use in them, or it affects accuracy as well. So I want to see more of that inside other turn-based RPG games. I think that's one of the things where they don't play around enough with set pieces. You mentioned, Ed, how boss battles or certain combat encounters, like you should take out certain enemies in a certain way, or an enemy might have multiple points to target, and you should take them down in a certain sequence. That would be optimal, but you can take them down in different sequences to turn off different attacks or to interrupt the enemies. So I do appreciate being able to see turn order, so you understand like how your speed ranking is. I appreciate being able to interrupt or being able to influence the turn order based on the attacks you choose to do, whether that's offensively taking away your opponent's turn, or planning out this character is not going to be able to act for 3 turns, so I'm going to do that. I do want to quickly point out that Pokemon Legends Arceus is going to have a system like that where you can execute a move either in a strong style or a quick style. So if you want to be able to attack multiple turns, or if you want to do a stronger version, but you'll won't be able to act for a longer period of time. I like having that choice and being able to make those tactical decisions. So I appreciate that. But going back to what I was saying about environmental or set piece interactions, if you're in a certain type of biome while you're in a combat, it'd be nice if you could have a free action or bonus actions where it's like, oh hey, there's trees around here, so I'm gonna like use the trees. Or you're in a desert and it's desert wind, so use a wind spell. It deals more damage because of that. I'm not saying that I've never seen that in other RPGs. Clearly, I point out Pokemon, and I'm sure there's like other indie ones. I think also Golden Sun had some an element like that with like weather or the moon or something like that. Or I might be thinking of another RPG that does that. But I'm not saying these systems aren't in some, but I've rarely seen they're not as prevalent as I'd like to see, and I rarely hear about like certain environmental interactions playing into these turn-based games where you can use the environment to your advantage, or there's much more intricacy to these fights. Maybe that's a deliberate choice that the developers are like, we want to keep it straightforward combat. We want to make sure all these systems work a certain way, and we only want very specific combat scenarios to have any sort of interaction, or when enemies are weak to certain elements or status effects and stuff like that. But I'm just looking for a little bit more variety in terms of how you interact, other than your characters, your classes. I mentioned combo abilities. There are some RPGs where you can really combo up with your players, and actually in real time, I've just been started playing Tales of Arise, and right now I only have my second party member. I was given a temporary third party member, but being able to call them in for a special attack, playing the demo, you can easily see like can have four people on there. You can combo attacks. You can knock enemies up into the air. You can knock them down to the ground and create hard knockdowns. So there's combinations you can do there where like your ranged character shoots an enemy out of the sky, knocks him down, makes it easier for your grounded character to do it. But then you can still do combo attacks where you can hit them on the ground a couple times, combo them back up into the air, keep the combo going. Then your teammates can jump in and combo. There's special combo attacks where they do like special actions, and then there's super combos where two characters are paired up. And it seemed like it was set in the demo. It's just only like a set amount of pairs. But from seeing a later trailer, it definitely looks like you'll be able to learn other team up attacks with different party members, so it won't just be like the same 5 types of attacks over and over again. I really appreciate that flexibility in combat, and I think that's what I'm really looking for when it comes to turn-based. Is just more flexibility and creativity, other than what attack do I pick, what action do I pick this turn? Is it a basic attack? Is it a special attack? Even just having different types of basic attacks, and like I said, Final Fantasy 7 had that. A couple other RPGs have that, and being able to then control like your opponent's positions and things like that. So those are the kind of elements in like turn-based games I would like to see more of, and types and some of the features I already mentioned that I appreciate and I think are really interesting. So that's kind of what I'm looking for, is that dynamic aspect there. But speaking of features, and I did mention Final Fantasy VII, and some people might say, is Final Fantasy VII really a turn-based game? So that's where I wanted us to build to, is this like the in between, because there's some games that mix and match these elements. Final Fantasy VII, and I think and Final Fantasy VI as well. I don't remember if 4 or 5 did this as well, but where your character's on a cooldown. So your turn is determined by speed rating. It's not just or I should say, there's like there's a active cooldown bar, and it's not just the math works out in the back end and then you see which it goes, like Final Fantasy X style, or even like Bravely Default in the back end, and then you can mix and match in extra actions or things like that. So Final Fantasy 12 is another good example of it's somewhere in between. Final Fantasy Online functions that way as well. So Ed, what are your
10-2.
Oh, thank you. Quick side tangent. So you were talking about like combos and things like that. So Final Fantasy X-2, which I believe is like the prototype for Final Fantasy 13's combat system. Final Fantasy X-2 did have a combo system where you could time up the bars, and if you did your actions quick enough, you had to be actually fast and know what actions you're going to go for. But then you could actually combo and get damage multipliers between the 3 characters attacking the enemy. And then they refined that for Final Fantasy 13 with the break system in order to deal more damage. And while you couldn't control the other 2 characters, which I thought was really strange, but being able to watch them and figure out that flow and then time your attacks in order to keep that damage, build up that meter, and eventually break the opponent, so you could get that huge damage multiplier, or interrupt them so they weren't able to attack anymore, and you could get a chance to just wail on them. So those kind of systems as well. But that's mixing, again, some real time and action elements. So yeah, Ed, what are your feelings on like the hybrids? Are they still like, would you consider them like turn based with if they have like that timer? Like where does the line between turn based and real time kind of fall for you?
I don't think I would consider them to be turn based.
Which ones?
At least not in the traditional sense. Ones where there's a meter that fills up, like ATB and Final Fantasy, and I think they're not necessarily turn based because your enemies they keep going as you're making your choices. And I know there's a wait mode where like if you enter a sub menu it pauses,
Mhm.
but it there is you really have to be on top of things. Would you consider? I don't think I would consider an MMO where you're on cooldowns to be turn based. So, and I definitely wouldn't consider Final Fantasy 12 to be turn based. I will say maybe this is an exception to the rule for me, but I recall liking that in Final Fantasy 13. I almost was like I kind of liked that you weren't micromanaging all your party members because I kind of enjoyed the idea that you were choosing like a general macro strategy with your paradigms, and it was more like your 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 party setup that determined whether you were able to stagger or withstand a strong attack, depending on what classes you chose. So I thought that was kind of enjoyable that I didn't always use auto battle, but you really could most of the time. And as
Of
long as
course
you
you
were
would,
switching
yeah.
to the right paradigms at the right times,
Mhm.
like I I didn't really, but I mean, you could and still probably be mostly successful if you were doing auto battle. But I thought it was cool that your success was more about observing the battle conditions, whether it was in a multi enemy battle or a boss battle, and making sure you were in the right paradigm. It was almost like you were choosing a stance that you were either in offense or defense or some sort of support role, and that was what really mattered. It wasn't necessarily your individual actions, but if you weren't in the right classes, you were going to have a hard time. So I thought that was kind of a cool system.
Yeah,
But
for 13, my biggest pet peeve was that the only thing that mattered in the battle was your party leader's HP. I hate any systems, and I think I've mentioned this on previous episodes. I hate any RPG or systems where there's a revive, you can be downed and revived mechanic where a single party members is the whole thing, even though like the whole game has a system for reviving characters that fall in combat. It applies to your team members, but doesn't apply to you. I think that's ridiculous if your other team members are up and can't use actions. And I don't mind allowing my other player characters to be mostly managed by the AI, as I've mentioned with Kingdom Hearts. I just prefer it when there's a system in place for ad hoc commands. And I think in 13, it was like you couldn't tell them attacks or spells. Maybe you could tell them in a paradigm shift or items as well. I thought there was some ad hoc commands. But I prefer when it's okay if they mostly manage it themselves, but it's nice to be able to also micromanage a bit. Kind of like in Mass Effect's really cool because your characters will use attacks and abilities all on their own, but also in between, if they haven't used anything, you can then order them in between. Like, okay, I want to set up this combo, or I want them to target this enemy and do these things. So I like having the mix of the two.
yeah, I'd say with rare exceptions like Final Fantasy 13 that I mentioned, I think having more control over your party is better. And that's one thing I'd like to see in more action games is the ability to write certain rules, kind of like with the Gambit system in Final Fantasy
Yeah.
12, to more finally control your AI party members. Like one thing that always drives me crazy in some party based RPGs that are action
Hmm.
and is some party members they will just burn through MP and burn through
Right.
items in a way that like it's infuriating because when you actually need those items or need that MP for healing, they've already used it all up. They're not smart with it. So I wish you had more control, maybe even just to like inhibit their use of those things because
Yeah.
that's a big complaint I have. Um, the other issue I have in action based is camera control and targeting.
Hmm.
Um, and I noticed this in near and particularly in the other world ends with you is that uh when you're targeting enemies, and actually in Neo you can only target enemies, there's no manual control, it's you're always targeting at least one enemy.
Hmm.
um when there are like 10 or 12 enemies, it's really hard to quickly target the one you actually care about because you have to like cycle through them one by one. I would like to see maybe an option to target like the highest HP enemy or the most
Mm-hmm.
powerful one, because sometimes you want to cycle through all the small ones and pick them off, but occasionally
Yeah.
there's like a more powerful attack by a large enemy that you'd like to uh, prevent. And there's this one boss battle in Neo that there's a bunch of small fries and there's a real big enemy where that big enemy will start up an attack and you'll all of a sudden be like, I gotta attack this enemy to prevent it. But I would have to like hit the analog stick like 5 or 6 times and really pay attention and make sure I
Yeah.
don't go past that. And it was really frustrating. And really the it wasn't the best boss battle, and you actually had to end up doing it twice. They repeated that boss battle, which was really
Oh.
annoying.
Oh
But
boy.
by then, like I knew the best strategy, but it wasn't fun. It was just frustrating. Like I was
Right.
able to beat it just fine because I knew how to manage it. But there are a few battles like that where I just wish there was easier control over who you're targeting and
Yeah.
where the camera was. But that I get that's a hard problem to solve.
Maybe I don't know. Like,
So
I think there's at this point there really isn't much of an excuse for not having a decent camera system, or at least having options to find a more comfortable camera and targeting system. Because I wanted to bring up, as you were talking on like lock-ons, Ghost of Tsushima, more of a modern game that had a controversial choice of having like a very soft lock-on, or even no lock-on. I'm not sure when it came to its combat, and a lot of fans were upset because they're used to third-person action games having a lock on of some sort so you could focus on an enemy and then just deal with it. But they didn't want the game to be like that. They felt like, well, you've got kind of a soft lock on so you can attack in that, but we want people to be able to seamlessly switch between who they're attacking and targeting just by tilting the analog stick. And that philosophy tracks, but I would say that's not an excuse for not having the option, because some people will probably function better with that, with having a true lock on, or even being able to toggle how strong the lock on is. And this is clearly something that they can adjust, just like how camera turning and reacting to player stances and what can be controlled. Marvel's Avengers, once again, there's multiple settings for how hard do you want the camera to track. And it's not the only game that does that, but there are other games where they can choose how strongly the camera adjusts to player actions or the soft lock-ons. And targeting system as well, especially since Neo, The World Ends With You, and if we're not saying enough, just to make sure that we want to delineate, when we say just Neo, listeners, we're not talking about the Tecmo Koei games, Koei Tecmo games, Neo, Nioh, 1 or 2, which are like Dark Souls likes. We're talking about Neo, Neo, The World Ends With You by Square Enix. It's more recently out there. Just to make sure, because I thought like, I wonder if anyone's going to get
yeah, I
confused.
guess I didn't even think about that. I forgot there
Yeah,
was a game called Neo.
yeah.
Yeah, that could be confusing.
So just to clarify, we should have said it a bit sooner, but regardless, now that we're on the same page. So yeah, and we've had targeting systems for years and things like that. And I'm not saying there isn't an art to getting it right. And I think Platinum Games, once again, has been like uh the genius of, well, we just don't have enemies that are off screen attack you because that's kind of unfair. How are you supposed to really react to that? So I
Is
think
that what they do?
for the most part, for at least Bayonetta 1 and 2,
I
I know that that's one of the things they.
I guess I never noticed that, and maybe that's part of the genius that I don't think I have those complaints with platinum games, so maybe they just yeah you I think you're right about that. I never noticed that, but that must be why I enjoy those. I enjoyed at
Yeah.
least Near so much is because it isn't frustrating. You're working with what you can see.
That and
That's
strong
cool.
sound cues. So you can
Yeah.
hear things to know like when attacks are winding up and whatnot.
Visual cues too, like a lot of the robots in Near, like their eyes would light up when they were about to attack.
Yes.
Like it was very easy to track what was
Yep.
going to happen.
Visual, audio.
They telegraph things well.
Yes. That was a point I was going to bring up too, is that telegraphing attacks is one of those things that happens way more often in a real-time game than when it comes to a turn-based. You can have telegraphing in turn-based, as you know, like, but it usually takes like a message and the game has to be programmed to be like, we're going to show off that this character is charging up a big attack, is
Hmm.
moving into position or whatever it could be. But it's a lot less often that you see telegraphing in turn-based than you see in real-time games. And in real-time games, they kind of want things to be telegraphed so you can react to them ahead of time. You have a much smaller window to react in general, but even basic actions can be telegraphed, and you can understand what your opponent might be trying to do in the next couple seconds based on how they're animating. Whereas with turn-based, it's a lot more their turn's going to happen. You're going to face off with whatever it is. You only have your experience of what attacks that they can possibly do. From that, I think even most games, like most turn-based games that I've experienced, at least, even if you can do like a scan ability, it doesn't list all their moves, and you don't get like a detailed list of how each attack works. Which is another thing I wish there was more information on. Is like just clearer rules, and this happens in real time as well. Like, and some of these can be just be like bugs and technical issues of like not knowing that hitboxes don't line up the right way, where your invincibility frames are on your dodge options or maneuverability options and things like that. So not saying either one has it uh, perfectly right, but it would be nice to have more of that information inside like tutorials or in a side mode where you can experiment in the game, or like a glossary in the game can kind of just tell like, hey, if you're trying to understand, this is what it looks like, this is where they are, um, and these are the features you have and tools to try and take advantage of the nuances of these systems. Um,
Fire Emblem is great for that because you can, every attack you do, you can see how much damage it's going to do, whether it's going to double, what its hit rate is, what its critical rate is, and you can check every enemy. You can see what items they hold. You can see their. I think you can see their stats, and you can see what abilities they have. So like, I
that's good.
I think as far as the turn-based strategy games goes, Fire Emblem does a great job of giving you all the information you need to make informed decisions.
Now, some of the times you're just supposed to adapt on the fly, and I'm not trying to disrespect that because I do understand
Yeah.
that and I appreciate it. And that's kind of like a simulation.
When they send reinforcements right when you think you're about to clear the map.
Yeah. But if I die like a couple times, I would like to be able to get, or even just to have it in a glossary thing, because turn-based RPGs can do this too. Is you fight an enemy a certain number of times, or you find this stuff out. If I'm remembering correctly, Bioshock One with its camera system also had like a thing where they told you more about it, about the enemies, or you just got the buffs. I forget if it was both, but like you had to see certain attacks a number of times and certain enemy types, and you got to learn nuances of how they moved and what they did. And that's all cool stuff too. Um, I think anything else really when it comes to turn-based and whatnot. Oh, that's right. I wanted to come back to the thing about what do we define between a turn-based and real time, because like there's the hybrid. But I guess a true turn-based game is just when literally you have a turn and your actions can't be interrupted during your planning and execution phase. It's actually like a full turn. You get to decide, make your actions, they execute, and there's no chance of interruption. Because I did want to also bring up that Final Fantasy VII had, and I'm not saying it's not the only one, but I clearly remember Final Fantasy VII has settings where you can change how fast you want the battle speed and whether you want true ATB style or uh, waiting style, where enemies wouldn't act while you're trying to pick your attacks. I think if their bar still filled up while you were doing attacks, like, and they were faster than you, that even if you just selected your action, they could still attack before your action carried out. I can't remember if that is how it worked, or if it went just true turn-based style, where the system did the math speed rating and had an invisible turn order, and just whenever it was your turn, you got to carry out your action. But there are games where
I believe the bars still fill up, and when you're in a sub menu select, like if you select magic and you're selecting your spell,
mm,
that's when it pauses and wait. But I think if you just leave your menu where it says, attack magic item there, things will keep going. But if
mm,
you're in the middle of selecting an attack, it will pause it. I believe that's how it works. Um,
but still, there are
yeah.
games where you can kind of choose between the two. I think that's a lot less common these days because they kind of commit to one or the other, like, or commit to being turn-based, hybrid, or real time, and then the two kind of just play out. Or like
Final Fantasy 15 had a wait mode, and I actually
it
used it because
did.
it would give you, but because it was easier to actually look at the weaknesses of the enemy when you were using the wait mode.
Right.
But when you were moving around and playing the game, it didn't wait. It was only if you like paused for a moment that
Right.
it paused. So it was useful, but for the most part, it was real time even when you were using wait mode because you were moving around a lot.
Yeah, and Final Fantasy VII Remake works in a similar way where you've got real time, and then it's just when you open your menus, the game pauses. I don't know if you can actually turn that off. I think you don't. But then they also have like a classic mode, which just means you're always selecting from the menu what your characters do, but everything's still happening kind of in real time, unless I think you open up like the skill menus and things like that. I'd have to double check. I haven't seen any extended gameplay of the classic mode for Final Fantasy VII, but I think that's also considered like the super easy mode. I don't think there's like a hard version
Actually,
of the classic
actually,
combat.
in Intergrade, they added difficulty
Yes, you're
options
right.
to the classic
Yep.
mode. So now you can play classic mode at a higher difficulty option, which is good because that's probably the way I'll end up playing it.
uh, yeah, and that's the thing. There's the hybrids, and I think I somewhere in between is the hybrids. Although, as I was mentioning, you could pause the menu and then pick your items, but then there's also hotkeys. So, like for Spider-Man and Ghost of Tsushima, I would like there to also be a hotkey system where I don't always have to dig through a menu and pause the combat to do stuff. I'd like the menu to be optional and be able to actually just hotkey all of my special abilities. Witcher 3 is one of the things where I was definitely very upset because I think you only get like 5 spells. I'm like, why can't I just hold right trigger or something like that and be able to pick from face buttons to have these items hotkeyed or these spells hotkeyed? And Kingdom Hearts is a perfect example where it's not perfect, but it's better than what I've seen in a lot of other action games where you have extensive options to select from, but you have to balance between using a menu and real time. So Kingdom Hearts 1, 2, any of the non Nintendo DS ones had a system where you can actually I think 358 might have had a hotkey system as well. No, oh, and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting because Kingdom Hearts 3D debuted on 3DS, and that was like a full console Kingdom Hearts. Apologies. But the hotkey system there, you could always select 4 actions, and it could be spells, it could be summons, I think most of the games, or it could be items. And then there was also the skill palettes. I don't know if there was actually a hotkey system in Birth by Sleep with like the rotating skill palette. I don't think you could hotkey
Mhm.
specific ones. You could move and rotate between that, but that was like you had to use buttons to rotate around that list. But it was a set list of 8 actions that you specifically put in there. Um, but then Kingdom Hearts 3 changed it up a little bit. And this is where like I will heap a ton of praise on Kingdom Hearts 3's gameplay systems. I'm a little sad that the flow motion system isn't as freeform as 3DS's. I really
Yeah,
like
I remember 3D being a blast. You're flying around like a freaking superhero.
Yeah, with 3D, you could totally jump around the entire environment with ever like landing, and it was great. Whereas in 3, they limited it and made the system much smaller. Like you can still grab onto environmental interactions. That's something I wanted to bring up too. Like Kingdom Hearts 3 lets you do environmental interactions. Spider-Man lets you grab the different objects around the environment for swinging attacks. Now, there's very few types of ways you can use it, and it's really based on what the action is. But for the most part, it's Spider-Man grabbing an object with his webs and then swinging it around, AoEing, and then slamming it on a guy. It'd be nice if Spider-Man could have like you could have some different interactions with items like that, but that stuff could be experimented with. It was already on the right track. So, um, yeah, with Kingdom Hearts 3, you had the hotkey system, and then they improved upon it. Not ideally, but it was still better than other stuff. Where they had 3 levels of hotkeys, and you could rotate between your hotkey palettes to try and mix up with that. So I appreciate that they were trying to add more, so I could be in the menus less, and I used it a lot. And I'd like to see that more in other real time action games as well, for allowing you to get those deeper options without having to pause all the time. Now, I appreciate still being able to pause. I think you can do both. I would just like to see those as well in real time. And of course, echoing Ed, continue to refine the cameras and at least allow us systems to tweak that to figure out how well that stuff gets to be managed. Because oftentimes, like with first person shooters and third person shooters, you're always facing the way the camera should be for shooting for the most part, and the way you want to attack. And then for action games, 3D action games where you're doing melee rather than shooting, you have to rely on aiming your camera, and that means taking your fingers off the buttons. Although, off the face buttons. Although it's funny because Tales of Rise is kind of in between on that. So they moved it where your basic attack and defense functions are on the shoulder buttons, which a lot of games have been doing ever since Dark Souls kind of set it, so you could keep your right thumb on your camera stick. Um, so there's still some balancing to be figured out there in game design for controls. But yeah, I hope all those things get improved, and I'd like to see more turn-based games. Maybe I got to do some investigation, and I feel like also the video game fan base out there might be really angry at me if I don't mention Undertale as a very unique mix of old school turn-based plus new school. Not just because you can like talk through with monsters, and I think that's really cool. That's a concept that's really unique for that game. But also their mix of like it's turn-based, but then when you're doing like attack actions or certain actions, I should say, not just attacks. There's the shoot 'em up real time, like moving around inside the box to go through the sequence, and that's also really cool. That's super innovative for a turn-based game, and that's once again a mix of turn-based and real time that gives the player more agency over how a round of combat's going to go, which I appreciate. I'm just not a big fan of shoot 'em up style action because that's a bit faster and very specific. I hate like the super pixely low. I guess yeah, my whole thing is about how much room for error do I have, because I'm aware of my limitations. I'm not a super skilled gamer. I'm just very competent. I've been there. I understand a lot of visual language, but my reflexes are still have a potential and limitation that I hit. So I like games that have a little bit more room for error built in their mechanics and don't ask for super tight stuff, or at least don't make it unclear when you mess up. Is it you messing up? Is the game messing up? Where's that lie? As long as it's transparent about that, I typically enjoy that. And I think that's also where part of my frustration comes from turn-based, where with that RNG, it's hard to tell if I was making the right choices or if I was just going to be screwed, or even if I was making all the right choices and the game just says, nope, you know what? We're going to drop the one-hit KO attack on the team today. And if you didn't on this turn, and we didn't telegraph it, we didn't, like, you should have just known. You should have been doing the math with every single attack. Like, okay.
Yeah, you want to talk about RNG that's annoying is like a game where like Persona where your party leader has to be alive the whole time and enemies are using like insta kill attacks and they just land a lucky one and yeah,
Yeah.
it can be annoying, but part of the game. I guess you could say that about
Right.
every game.
And
Oh,
that's
it's part of the game, bro.
and you make a good point there is also you go in with the attitude of like, this is how these games are going to be. And I think that's the thing is understand what the games are, hopefully the games are more upfront about them, and then yeah, enjoy them for what they are. I'd like to see new things. I still look at turn-based games because there's interesting stuff that can be done. And let me I'm not we're way over time, so I'm not going to pull out the list, but I'm sure we'll mention these other games, and I'll be sure to call it out as I enjoy other turn-based games. But yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to say on the topic today. And Ed, was there anything else you wanted to say before we go?
No, I think I got everything out, but I mean, I guess I remain open to both kinds. And I like to try new games. You know, it's just tough because everyone's time is limited, so you have to pick and choose. So sometimes you fall back into what you know you like,
Yeah.
that's okay too.
That's why we have like Game Pass and GameFly, so you can try a whole bunch of games for
And
less
demos,
expense. And
so
demos.
many
Demos are
games get
great.
demos these days.
Yeah,
I know,
it's a golden age of demos and free betas and stuff like that. So that's
and
super
you don't
enjoyable.
even have to buy a video game magazine to get them.
Oh, not anymore. Alrighty, well that's it for today's episode. Thank you everyone so much for being here and listening. Feel free to look through our back catalog and do that stuff. Like and subscribe. Listen to us wherever YouTube and various other podcast platforms. Ed, thank you so much for having another conversation with me today.
Mhm.
Thanks for choosing the topic.
I pretty much have to, don't I? I'm roped in at this point.
Thanks for suggesting this topic for today. And yeah, everyone take care and can't wait to do another episode.
Bye.